Hey everyone, today I want to do my first impressions of our first raid tier for Dawntrail. I took a little bit of a break over the weekend because it was a bit of a busy week. We didn't have the raid gear that we could craft a week beforehand like we were able to do for our last expansion. Like we always got a week head start on the crafting stuff. Didn't have that this time around. And then of course I've been raiding every day on top of also working some of the days. So I needed to catch up on some sleep and just kind of take a break over the weekend to recharge my batteries, as it were, because there was some other stuff going on in my personal life as well, which made it quite busy and very sleepless. So I just needed to kind of recharge over there. But I've done so now. And thus I want to just kind of talk about our last raid here, because I did have a pretty good time going through it this time around. When it comes down to the thematic of the raid this time around, we had a tournament arc. We knew it was going to be a tournament arc, and because of that I wasn't necessarily super interested in what the story was going to be. I still wanted to kind of check out what the story was going to be about, but for the first 80% of the story or so, it was exactly what you could expect from a tournament arc. You go there, you're a contestant, you fight against other contestants. There you go, nothing too special. Now, at the end of the story, we do get a bit of a glimpse into where the story will kind of lead going forward, which does seem to be taking an interesting direction. Like, I'm at least curious to see where the story is going to go, and I'm not just going to be like, okay, from here on out, I'm just gonna hit skip cutscene, because it's not really that interesting. So I'm at least interested to see where it's gonna go. In terms of how the bosses were designed, I feel like this was pretty clever as well. You're still going to be fighting against other people, like not necessarily humans, because we have cat girls and dragons and stuff. But we're still going to be fighting against normal people that then infuse their soul with a feral soul, and that's kind of like how they become the bosses that we go and fight. I might not necessarily be the biggest of fans of how some of the bosses look like, but thematically at least I feel like they did a pretty good job here. We're fighting in the Arcadion. These people are used to using all of this soul technology, so infusing their souls with feral souls to then become the boss. It kind of just makes a lot of sense, and I think that they did a pretty good job, kind of like thematic wise. The arenas themselves also make you feel like you are part of a tournament. There's an audience in the stands, they're cheering you on, they're cheering the boss on. There's an announcer that actually does announcer things, like he's not just announcing what's going on with the boss fight, but he's also announcing what's going on with your team. Like if somebody gets knocked out of the arena, he'll be like, oh no, a contestant was thrown out of the ring. Or when you get resurrected, he's like, they're back on their feet. And that's actually something that I wasn't really expecting. I was expecting the commentating on what the boss is doing and kind of like have these scripted lines, but I wasn't really expecting him to also comment on what your team is doing, which is something that I did quite enjoy, and it adds some extra immersion into the fights as well. For the music this time around, we got unique tracks for every single raid fight, which I don't think we've ever had before, and if we have, then it's probably a very long time ago that I can't remember it. But it is something that I really enjoyed. I think that the music in Final Fantasy is probably one of the things that is always good regardless of where we are. And this time around, just having a unique track for every single fight, I thought was just a really nice thing. Final Fight also has two separate tracks, like the first song is just a banger, and then as soon as you hit that transition, you just kind of get that hype music. You hear the chords coming in, you've got the choir coming in, and then it just turns in from like a banger of a song into kind of like an epic soundtrack where it's like, okay, time to lock in and clear this thing. It just felt really good overall. So visuals, great, music, great. While I might not necessarily like, I think like the first song and maybe like the second one I was quite hesitant about as well going into Savage. Because it was like, yeah, it's a funny song when you do it for like 10 minutes on normal mode. But what if I'm listening to this for like 2-3 hours when I'm doing Savage? I wasn't sure how I felt about that, but in the end it ended up being fine and the song just like kinda stuck. So yeah, overall, didn't really mind it too much. Like the first song is like the one that I like the least, I think, but it's still not a bad song by any stretch. So overall, I feel like that was great. In terms of the enrages, quickly want to touch on that as well. The DPS check this time around was quite easy, maybe not necessarily for the first 3 fights, because I feel like the second and third fight, like we did see Enrage on those two, those I feel like the DPS check was quite alright. The first fight had an easy one, but it's also the first fight, so that one is always quite easy. But the final fight, I was actually quite surprised how easy the DPS check was on that one. Like, my group ended up clearing with 1 DPS dying, who was then resurrected with weakness, and then we had, I believe, a tank and a DPS die, and those were resurrected with a heal LB, and we didn't even get close to the Enrage. Like, I feel like if we would have wiped on that pull, it's because we died to the soft Enrage, and not because we got all the way to the Enrage. So I thought that was kind of like undeserved of us to clear, because normally you shouldn't really clear a final fight with heal LB and people dying. But I have seen some things. I know a friend of mine who clears with 10 people dying, 7 of which were DPSs. So it's kind of like, yeah, that probably shouldn't really be a thing for week 1. Week 1 is always kind of looked at as this very difficult challenge, especially for the final fight, mostly because of the DPS check that is so tightly tuned. But this time around it was very easy. Probably because of how the balancing was done on the patch itself. Pictomancer probably ended up being a bit stronger than anticipated, and because of that they ended up buffing a lot of other classes instead of nerfing Pictomancer, and because of that we are probably just way stronger than they wanted us to be for the first raid tier, and they didn't adjust the HP of the bosses to accommodate for the buffs that we got. So that's probably why the DPS check is so much easier. On one hand, I also don't really mind it too much. It makes for a very great entry point for people that are new to raiding to kind of get into it. Of course, the first raid tier is always a bit easier than the rest of the expansion, so I feel like if this is kind of like the entry point for a lot of new people coming in, like new expansion, new story start, because we did finish the first story for Final Fantasy and Endwalker, so it's like new story, new chapter, maybe a lot of new players coming in. If this is like their first experience with raiding in the game, it could make for a very good entry point for new people to get into it, and then I certainly don't mind it. Going back on the Enrages though, this time not talking about DPS, I very much so liked that 3 out of 4 of the bosses actually have a unique Enrage that is not simply here's a long cast bar and when it finishes the boss hits you for max damage. The final boss still has that, like she just casts her raid-wide AoE, and then when the cast bar finishes you just fall over and die. But the other 3 bosses actually have very fun Enrages. The first boss will just start destroying the arena until no tiles are left and everybody just falls to the floor. The second boss, very on brand as well, she just charms everybody, you dance for a few seconds and then she hits you with another raid wipe that will then one-shot everybody. And the third boss, that one is definitely my favorite. He just casually goes untargetable, walks out of the arena, and then body slams your team like the wrestler that he is, because the third boss is a wrestler. You're also fighting in kind of like a wrestler arena. And then he just like goes to the edge of the arena, stands on like the pole that's there, whatever that thing's called, and then he just like somersault, front flips into the arena, belly flop, and then everybody dies. Just really fun to see. Like every time we hit Enrage, which was like maybe once or twice, it was literally just, alright, don't just wall it, look at what the boss is doing and just let him belly flop us. That was really fun to see. So I do hope that they kind of keep that going into the next raid tier as well, because it's just a lot more fun than just a boring ass cast bar that finishes and then you just fall over. This is at least something where you're like, oh, I'm curious to see what the boss is gonna do now. And it was really fun to see. When it then comes down to the mechanics, it's kind of like the last point I want to talk about. I'm a very big fan of how the mechanics were designed this time around. In Endwalker and sometimes previous fights as well before that, there started to kind of be a lot of debuff vomit, I guess is what the best way to describe it, where you got a lot of debuffs and depending on the debuffs that you got, you had to like remember what they all did, and then you would go to a specific position to then resolve the debuffs or resolve the mechanic. Personally, not a huge fan of all of that. I'm someone that much more prefers fights that are very intuitive, like the boss does something or she'll show you something, or you get like a specific animation on top of you and you kind of figure out the mechanic that way. Like very puzzly, cryptic mechanics. It's not really my favorite thing when it comes down to raiding. I much more prefer mechanics that are very visually intuitive as to like, oh, this is what the boss is doing, this is what we get, figure it out, right? Like I think the second fight did a pretty good job with that, where you see how many hearts you have above your character, you know that the boss is doing mechanics that will give you a heart, and then it's like, okay, how do we figure this out so that nobody gets full heart stacks? And then we just go from there. And on the final boss as well, there are a lot of mechanics where you get a debuff, but it is also visually shown on your character. Like, do you have the electrode debuff, yes or no? It is shown on your character that you literally have a purple ring around you with electrodes swirling around you, which makes it very visually easy to see for your party as well, to see who still has the debuff, because for some mechanics you'll need to like stack together, and then you know who the people are that you need to stack with. Same thing when you get the colored debuff, the blue or the yellow debuff, it is shown on your character so you can visually keep track of where you need to go, which I thought was a really cool thing. The only real debuff vomity mechanic that we had was on the final fight. There's literally just one mechanic in the entire tier where you have to pay attention to what debuff you get. And then it's literally just, do I have blue, purple, or the blue/green debuff? And then depending on those three, you go to a specific position. But that was still very easy to identify and just kind of get used to. So I feel like that was really nicely done. Outside of that one mechanic, whenever you got a debuff, the only reason you got it was to see whether or not you had the short debuff or the long debuff. And I feel like that's much more fun to kind of like play around with, rather than have like these million debuffs that you have to get used to every single time and always be looking at your buff bar to see what debuff you got. I much prefer to look at the boss fight and see what's going on, rather than just be staring at my buff bars all the time to see what the boss is giving me. So to speak. Now, because of the fact that a lot of the mechanics were a lot more intuitive to figure out, probably contributed to the raid tier dying as fast as it did. I think this might be one of the fastest raid clears that we've ever had. So it's kind of a combination of very intuitive mechanic design on top of an easy DPS check that made it so that people cleared the final boss as fast as they did. But for me personally, I think this is just a really fun raid tier. The mechanics were fun to figure out, fun to execute. There's still a challenge to be had as well, because it's not just a face roll either, like the fights are still somewhat challenging. So it's just a really good combination of everything really. Good music, good visuals, fight design is really good, DPS check maybe not so much. But outside of that, like, it's just a really fun raid here. And at the moment, I'm just playing games to have fun, don't necessarily need to be challenged just for the sake of being challenged. As long as I can have a good time with it, then I'm going to be very happy. So I am just very happy with this raid here as well. And I'm looking forward to doing my re-clears on Wednesday. Doing it on Wednesday because Tuesday I have a late shift, so we can't really raid then. But we're going to be doing our re-clears on Wednesday. We'll see how far we get. Hopefully we can clear the whole thing, but if not, we'll just take a second day and we'll be good, most likely. But yeah, been a really fun raid here. Looking forward to doing our re-clears. And looking forward to what else we're going to be getting this expansion, because we still have 2 ultimates, most likely. We already know 1 at least. We'll have our Arcadion dungeons again as well, which those have always been really fun, so can't wait to see what those are going to be. And then of course 24-man raid and the other 8-man raids are going to be coming as well. Just really looking forward to the content that we're going to be getting throughout the rest of this expansion. And yeah, that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in this video. If you're still progging, good luck. Wish you the best of luck to try and get your clears in. And yeah, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.